All right, let me tell you a story. A story about betrayal, heartbreak, and the kind of revenge that leaves you breathless. It's not just any story, it's his story. And it all began on a night like any other. David wasn't supposed to be at that bar. He didn't even like bars. The loud music, the sticky floors, the smell of cheap beer mixed with desperation, it wasn't his scene. But that night, something pulled him there. Call it fate, call it coincidence, call it whatever you want. He walked in, ordered a whiskey neat, and sat in the farthest corner where the shadows swallowed him whole. He wasn't looking for anything, just a moment to himself, away from the suffocating silence of his home. And then he heard it. At first, it was just noise, laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of conversation blending into the background. But then a voice cut through the chaos, sharp and smug. "Man, you wouldn't believe it." The voice said, loud enough to carry across the room. "She's married. Can you believe that? Married. And still couldn't keep her hands off me." David froze. His glass hovered inches from his lips as his heart began to pound in his chest. He told himself it was nothing, just some drunk guy bragging about his conquests. But then the voice continued. "Her name's Emily," the man said with a chuckle that made David's stomach churn. "Blonde hair, green eyes. God, she's gorgeous." David's blood ran cold. Blonde hair, green eyes. Emily. His Emily. The world around him seemed to blur as his mind raced to catch up with what he was hearing. The man kept talking, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. "Her husband?" he said with a dismissive laugh. "Some clueless guy who probably thinks she's an angel." Clueless guy? Clueless. David felt like someone had punched him in the gut. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on him as he tried to breathe through the rising tide of anger and disbelief. He wanted to stand up, march over there, and wipe that smug grin off the guy's face. But he didn't move. He couldn't move. Instead, he listened. The man went on and on about their secret meetings, the hotel rooms, the stolen moments when David was at work or out of town. Every word felt like a dagger slicing through his chest, each one sharper than the last. David gripped his glass so tightly he thought it might shatter in his hand. And then something shifted inside him. The pain was still there. It burned like fire, but underneath it was something else. Something darker. It started as a flicker, a tiny spark of rage, and then it grew into an inferno that consumed him entirely. He didn't confront the man that night. No, that would have been too easy, too quick. And David wasn't interested in easy or quick anymore. He wanted justice. As he sat there in that dark corner of the bar, hidden from view but fully aware of every word being spoken just a few feet away, David made a decision. He wasn't going to let this slide. He wasn't going to be the clueless husband anymore. He was going to make them pay. But first, he needed a plan. David stayed until the man left, watched him swagger out of the bar like he owned the place, and followed him at a safe distance. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly. Maybe an address, maybe a name. But he knew he had to start somewhere. The man got into a sleek black car parked just outside and drove off into the night. David followed him in his own car, keeping far enough back to avoid suspicion but close enough not to lose him. They drove for miles through winding streets until they reached an upscale neighborhood filled with sprawling houses and perfectly manicured lawns, the kind of place where secrets were buried under layers of wealth and privilege. The man pulled into one of the driveways and disappeared inside, without a second glance over his shoulder. David sat in his car across the street for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his mind racing with questions and possibilities as he tried to piece together what had just happened. Who was this guy? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, why? Why would Emily do this? Why would she betray him like this? He thought about their life together, the years they'd spent building something he thought was unshakable, the laughter they'd shared, the promises they'd made, all those little moments that made up their marriage, and suddenly it all felt like a lie. But even as anger threatened to consume him again, there was another emotion bubbling beneath the surface: determination. David wasn't just going to sit back and let this destroy him, not without a fight. He didn't know how yet, or when, or where, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And so began David's journey, a journey fueled by betrayal, but driven by something much stronger: resolve. Because sometimes life doesn't give you closure. You have to take it for yourself. And David? Well, let's just say he was ready to take what was his, no matter what it cost him. or them, in the end. David didn't sleep that night. How could he? The words he overheard at the bar played on a loop in his mind, like a haunting melody he couldn't escape. Every smug laugh, every casual detail of betrayal, every mention of Emily's name, it all burned into his memory. But amidst the chaos in his head, one thought stood out crystal clear. He wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, David sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in front of him. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm golden hues across the room, but he felt none of its warmth. His mind was elsewhere, focused, calculating. He wasn't just angry anymore. Anger was fleeting, impulsive. No, what David felt now was something colder, sharper. It was resolve. This wasn't going to be a reckless act of rage. No shouting matches or punches thrown in a parking lot. That would be too easy for Mark, too easy for Emily. They'd walk away from it bruised but intact. And David? He'd still be the one left picking up the pieces. No, this had to be different. He needed a plan, a meticulous, foolproof plan that would make them feel every ounce of pain they had inflicted on him. But where to start? Revenge wasn't something David had ever considered before. He was a straightforward guy, honest to a fault, some might say. He believed in fairness, in doing the right thing. But now he realized that sometimes the right thing wasn't enough. He pulled out a notebook and began to write. At first, it was just scattered thoughts, fragments of ideas that didn't quite fit together. But as he wrote, a picture began to form in his mind. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted justice. And justice meant making Mark and Emily face the consequences of their actions in a way they couldn't ignore or escape. Step 1. Gather information. David knew he couldn't act without knowing exactly who he was dealing with. He started with Mark, the man whose arrogance had shattered his life in a single night. David remembered the address from when he followed Mark home and decided it was time to dig deeper. He spent hours online, piecing together Mark's life like a puzzle. Social media profiles, professional bios, public records, everything he could find became another piece of the picture. Mark wasn't just some random guy. He was successful, well-connected, and deeply respected in his community. A real pillar of society, as they say. But beneath the polished exterior was something darker, a pattern of manipulation and deceit that David couldn't ignore. Old posts from ex-girlfriends hinted at infidelity and emotional abuse. Business reviews described him as ruthless and cutthroat. It became clear that Mark wasn't just someone who made a mistake. He was someone who thrived on taking what didn't belong to him. And then there was Emily. David didn't want to look into her life. Not really. But he knew he had to understand why she did what she did if he wanted his plan to work. He went through her phone when she wasn't looking, scrolling through messages and photos with shaking hands. The evidence was all there. Texts from Mark filled with flirtation and innuendo, photos taken in places David had never been. It hurt more than anything else to see her smiling in those pictures, looking happier with Mark than she had with him in years. But it also fueled his determination. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his sense of self-worth. Step 2. Get close. David knew that if he wanted his plan to succeed, he couldn't act from a distance. He needed to get inside Mark's world, to become someone Mark trusted implicitly before pulling the rug out from under him. It started small. Casual encounters at places David knew Mark frequented, coffee shops, networking events, even the gym. At first, Mark barely noticed him. A nod here, a polite smile there. But over time, David began to insert himself into conversations subtly and strategically. "Hey," David said one day at the gym after spotting Mark struggling with a weight machine. "Need a hand?" Mark looked up, surprised but grateful. "Yeah, thanks," he said with a grin that made David's skin crawl. From there, it snowballed. David played the role of an eager admirer perfectly, laughing at Mark's jokes, complimenting his achievements, even asking for advice on things he already knew how to do just to stroke Mark's ego. Mark ate it up. Step 3. Set the trap. By now, David had earned Mark's trust, or at least enough of it for him to let his guard down. And that's when David began planting seeds, small suggestions and half-truths designed to make Mark doubt himself and those around him. "Man," David said one day over drinks after work, "you ever feel like people only stick around because they want something from you?" Mark frowned slightly, but shrugged it off with another sip of whiskey. Comes with the territory, he said casually. But David could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the tiniest crack in his armor, and knew it was only a matter of time before those cracks widened into chasms. At home, things were different, or at least they seemed that way on the surface. Emily acted like nothing had changed between them, like she hadn't betrayed him in the worst possible way, but David saw through her facade easily enough. He didn't confront her, not yet, but every interaction felt like walking on broken glass. Painful and precarious, but necessary if he wanted everything to fall into place. Step 4. Wait for the perfect moment. David knew that timing was everything when it came to revenge, that striking too soon or too late could ruin everything he'd worked so hard for. And so he waited patiently for weeks, months, until finally, the moment arrived. But that's another story altogether. A story about how justice isn't always served cold, but sometimes, just sometimes, it's served perfectly timed instead. David had spent months preparing for this moment. Months of biting his tongue, suppressing the fire that burned in his chest every time he saw Mark's smug face or Emily's feigned innocence. Months of playing the role of the unsuspecting husband, the friendly acquaintance, the man who didn't know any better. But tonight, the mask would come off. Tonight, everything would unravel. It started with an invitation. David had planned it carefully, crafting every detail with precision. He decided to host a small dinner party at his home, a casual gathering of friends and acquaintances, just enough people to make it feel lively, but intimate enough for everyone to pay attention when the time came. And, of course, Mark was on the guest list. So was Emily. The invitations were sent out with a tone of casual excitement. Just a little get-together, David had said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Good food, good drinks, good company. No one suspected a thing. The night arrived, and David stood in his living room, surveying the scene he had meticulously set up. The house was immaculate, every surface polished to a shine. Soft jazz played in the background, mingling with the hum of conversation as guests began to arrive. The air smelled of roasted garlic and herbs from the dishes he'd prepared, a feast meant to disarm and delight. But beneath the warm glow of candlelight and laughter, there was an undercurrent of tension that only David could feel. It coiled tightly in his chest like a snake waiting to strike. Mark arrived fashionably late, as David had expected. He walked in with his usual swagger, flashing that overconfident grin that made David's stomach churn. Emily greeted him warmly, too warmly, and David felt his jaw tighten. But he forced himself to smile and shake Mark's hand like they were old friends. "Glad you could make it," David said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Wouldn't miss it," Mark replied, clapping David on the shoulder as if they shared some unspoken camaraderie. As the evening went on, David played the perfect host. He poured drinks, told jokes, and made sure everyone felt at ease. But all the while, he kept an eye on Mark and Emily, watching their stolen glances, their subtle touches when they thought no one was looking. It disgusted him, but it also fueled him. Finally, when dinner was served and everyone was seated around the table, David decided it was time to set his plan into motion. He stood at the head of the table, raising his glass for a toast. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice warm and inviting. "It means a lot to have so many wonderful people here under one roof." The guests smiled and murmured their appreciation, lifting their glasses in response. "But," David continued, his tone shifting slightly, just enough to catch their attention, "there's something I need to share with all of you tonight. Something personal." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Even Mark and Emily looked up from their plates, curiosity flickering in their expressions. David took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over them like a heavy fog. "You see," he said slowly, "I've learned something recently that changed my life forever." He paused for effect, scanning the room as if searching for courage. Then he turned his gaze directly toward Mark. "I learned," he said evenly, "that trust is a fragile thing." Mark's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "That's true," he said with a chuckle that sounded forced. "It really is." David didn't smile back. "And betrayal," David continued, his voice growing colder with each word, "is like a poison. It seeps into everything, your thoughts, your relationships, and destroys them from the inside out." The tension in the room was palpable now. Guests exchanged uneasy glances while Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Emily looked pale. David reached under the table and pulled out a folder. A simple manila folder that seemed harmless enough, but held within it everything he needed to bring them down. "I want to show you all something," he said calmly as he opened the folder and began laying out its contents on the table for everyone to see. Photographs of Mark and Emily together in places they shouldn't have been. Copies of text messages filled with flirtation and deceit. Hotel receipts with dates that coincided perfectly with nights David had been working late or out of town. The room erupted into shocked gasps and murmurs as guests leaned forward to examine the evidence. Mark's face turned ashen as he stared at the photos in disbelief. "What is this?" he demanded angrily. "This," David replied coolly, "is proof." Emily looked like she might faint. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered his name, "David." But he cut her off with a sharp glance. "Don't," he said firmly. Mark tried to regain control of the situation by standing up and pointing an accusatory finger at David. "You're crazy," he spat. "You've been spying on us, invading our privacy." David didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, the predator closing in on its prey, and said quietly but firmly, "You invaded my marriage." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air like thunder before a storm. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke or moved. The only sound was Emily's quiet sobbing as she buried her face in her hands. Finally, one of the other guests broke the silence by standing up abruptly and saying awkwardly, "I think we should go." One by one they filed out, some offering awkward apologies or sympathetic looks while others avoided eye contact altogether, until only David remained standing alone in his living room surrounded by empty chairs and shattered illusions. But despite everything, the betrayal, the humiliation, the heartbreak, for once in his life, he felt free. David stood in the middle of his living room, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been his life. The chairs were empty, the table cleared, and the silence was deafening. But he didn't feel broken anymore. No, for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something close to peace. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something better than the suffocating weight of betrayal. It was freedom. The fallout from that dinner party was swift and brutal. Mark's reputation was destroyed overnight. The photos, the messages, the receipts, they spread like wildfire through their social circles, leaving no room for denial or excuses. Mark tried to salvage what he could, spinning lies and blaming David for overreacting. But it was useless. His friends turned their backs on him. His colleagues distanced themselves, and even his family expressed their disappointment in hushed tones. For a man who thrived on control and admiration, losing everything was a fate worse than death. Emily wasn't spared either. She tried to reach out to David in the days following the dinner party, texts, calls, even showing up at his office, but he refused to engage. Her apologies felt hollow, her tears insincere. She begged him to talk, to let her explain, but David knew there was nothing she could say that would undo what had been done. He filed for divorce the following week. It wasn't an easy decision, not by any stretch of the imagination. Emily had been his partner for years, his confidant, his best friend. They had built a life together, a home filled with memories that now felt tainted beyond repair. But David couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies. He couldn't look at her without seeing Mark's smug face or hearing those words from the bar echoing in his mind. So he let her go. The divorce proceedings were straightforward but painful. Emily didn't contest anything. She seemed too consumed by guilt to fight for what they'd built together. David kept the house, their shared space, and she moved into a small apartment across town. He heard through mutual friends that she was struggling to adjust to her new reality, but he didn't reach out. He couldn't. Instead, David focused on rebuilding himself. At first, it was hard, harder than he'd expected. The house felt too quiet without Emily's laughter or the sound of her footsteps padding down the hallway. He avoided their favorite spots around town, the coffee shop where they used to sit and talk for hours, the park where they walked hand in hand on lazy Sunday afternoons, because every corner held a memory that threatened to pull him under. But slowly, things began to change. David started going out more. Not to bars or parties, but to places where he could be alone with his thoughts without feeling lonely. Bookstores filled with quiet corners and endless possibilities. Hiking trails where the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Art galleries that reminded him of beauty in its purest form. He rediscovered old hobbies, painting, cooking elaborate meals for himself, and found solace in creating something new from scratch. It was therapeutic in a way he hadn't anticipated, a reminder that life could still be beautiful even after everything had fallen apart. And then there were the people, the ones who showed up when he least expected it, but needed them most. Friends who invited him over for dinner just so he wouldn't have to eat alone. Colleagues who offered words of encouragement during long workdays. Strangers who smiled at him on the street as if they somehow knew he needed it. Bit by bit, David began to feel whole again. He didn't forget what happened, not entirely, but he stopped letting it define him. The betrayal became a chapter in his story rather than its entirety, a scar that reminded him of where he'd been but didn't dictate where he was going. As for Mark and Emily, their lives continued on separate paths. Mark tried to rebuild his reputation but never quite succeeded. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when arrogance blinds you to your own flaws, and faded into obscurity over time. Emily eventually found someone new, a man who seemed kind and genuine from what David heard, but she never reached out again after their divorce was finalized. Maybe she knew it would have been futile. Maybe she finally understood that some bridges can't be rebuilt once they've been burned down completely. And David? Well, David found peace, not just in moving forward, but in letting go. One evening months after everything had unfolded, when the sun was setting over the city in shades of gold and crimson, David stood on a hill overlooking it all. The streets where strangers hurried home, the buildings bathed in warm light, the horizon stretching endlessly before him like an open invitation. He took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs completely and makes you feel alive, and smiled faintly as he whispered to himself, "I'm okay." Because sometimes healing isn't about forgetting or forgiving. It's about accepting what happened and choosing not to let it hold you back anymore. And David? He chose freedom over everything else.